Steele and I'm the National Director with Action for Children, and I'd like to pass to Christina.
Morning everyone, I'm Christina Moody. I work at CYCJ as a Research Associate and I was the evaluator on IAP.
And Kira.
Hi everybody, my name is Kira Irvin and I work at Action for Children and I have been the Engagement Coordinator for IAP.
And Tim, do you want to say a quick hello?
Sure. Hi everyone, my name is Tim Hobbs, Chief Exec at Dartington Service Design Lab. We were supporting with some of the design and systemic change activities.
Okay, that's great. We're going to run through a presentation today, and then at the end of that presentation there's going to be an opportunity for people to ask questions. So I'm just going to ask Kira to share the presentation with everyone and then we can make a start. It's always the pressure when you're the person who's sharing the presentation, isn't it? Because everyone's watching your mouse click around the screen, getting to present, but
sorry, I suddenly forgot where the buttons were.
That's us. I think it's over to you, Christina, isn't it?
It is. Hi, just to reconfirm that, welcome again. So just a quick note to say this webinar will be recorded and will be available on the CYCJ website soon after. So just bear that in mind. We've already introduced ourselves, so we're hoping to leave some. Actually, could you move on to the next slide, please, Kira? Just that gives a bit of a run through of what we're planning to do today. So we're hoping to leave a little bit of time at the end so that you can ask any questions. If you have any questions as we go through, just please put them in the chat and we will hopefully get to you hopefully by the end. But this was a large 5-year project. There's a lot to fit in. We're not going to be able to fit in all of it. But we're going to just start off by going to Fiona Steele. So she's going to try and set the scene a little bit regarding the why of inclusion as prevention.
Thanks very much, Christina. So I'm going to talk us through a little bit about the specific needs which South Lanarkshire identified, what they hope to address and achieve, and why Action for Children were interested in being part of the project. So as you can see from the slide, South Lanarkshire had identified needs which are similar to those in other areas, and I think needs which we still see and recognise today. And they were highlighting issues that we're consistently grappling with across professional networks, where we're trying to work preventatively and stop children being in conflict with the law and halt their engagement with and escalation through the system. So that was the context there. Early intervention and prevention is something that we're all committed to. However, it can't be achieved without a focus on systems change, and we've increasingly, came to focus on that. And that change came across needs to come across multiple systems, including the legal framework we operate in, the children's hearing system, and how we identify and crucially support vulnerable young people. And another factor in this is money and secure and sustained investment in preventative approaches, and that's a key issue for us. So when we started talking to South Lanarkshire Council about the project as Action for Children, we were really keen and committed to being involved in preventative work approaches, and we could see that the ethos of inclusion as prevention was a critical one in that journey and pathway for children and young people in conflict with the law. But I mean, at the earliest stage of discussion and preparing to apply, I think there was a notion that we would all work together as partners. We might do a test of change approach. That might have been a bigger scale project, that we would engage young people as part of that, and we'd test and evaluate the approach, and maybe, to some extent have something neatly packaged up, because that's quite often how we work, A plus B equals C, and here we go. And I have to confess, I thought we would end up with a tested intervention. We tried to implement it, we'd evaluate that intervention, and then we would share those outcomes. Well, the early action systems change funding programme and parameters leads us down a different path, a very different path. And we knew we wanted to focus on inclusion as prevention. And we all agree that's a no-brainer. For example, we know children and young people who remain in full-time education will experience protective factors. However, we were looking at inclusion across a wider spectrum: school, family, community, society, but also within the systems that the young people were part of. And the application and initial process of the project set up meant we very quickly moved our thinking and began to talk about moving away or moving further than taking participative approaches to thinking about how we're going to try and engage young people to fully co-produce the work and the test of change we're doing. And to be honest, it took us a while to get the right participation lead in the role. And we've got our fabulous Kira here, and you'll hear more about the work that she's been doing. But she gave young people time and energy, or young people worked with Kira and they gave all their time and energy and thoughts and experiences. And I think we'll be able to share how essentially giving the young people that power in the process did impact the results and change the direction of travel. And just to say, this was pre-promise. We started this project 5 years ago, but it does embody the promise. And that's been about young people identifying how they may have needed or need support, what that should look like, what can make a difference, and then developing solutions and putting those in place to test them out and evaluate, not the professionals. It also predated COVID, and obviously that did have an impact on some of the activities undertaken at different points in the timeline. And thinking about moving on, Kira, to the partnership thing. So the partnership, you can see the agencies involved here all bringing different skills, and what's missing from the list is clearly the young people. So these were the professional agencies involved, and you can imagine us as agencies forming our partnership relationships, agreeing who was doing what. Quite a complex project, but it's been a strong partnership. We agreed the project elements, and the key driver that's made the difference here is the young people's engagement, ideas and input. I think if you look at the list and you could think about some of the push and pull of the power, yet ultimately we all settled into the young people leading the direction of the test of change. The professionals stood back from that and the young people led the direction. And meanwhile, we worked together to create the leadership culture where inclusion as prevention was seen as a way of being, and it became part of the language of the partners. And in this way, you can see that the project has had wider impact on systems within the council. And there's also 3 core strands of activity, which we can see there: engagement, system change, improvement and evaluation, which we'll hear more about now. And I'm going to pass you back to Christina, who's going to talk about the evaluation.
Thanks, Fiona. So, I mean, obviously, the CYCJ role, my role, was evaluating what was going on. So a lot of this was describing the journey, really capturing what a project does when it has a set aim, but not necessarily a very clear path to what it's going to be. It wasn't like as Fiona touched on, we didn't end up creating a fabulous intervention that we could then roll out or scale up. That's not really how the project led in the end. So the evaluation sort of described how IAP was delivered. Can it lead to better individual outcomes? Can that contribute to longer term outcomes in South Lanarkshire and sustainable system change? And what can we learn from this whole process about engagement, participation, co-production and service redesign? So the evaluation report is due out in a couple of weeks, so do keep an eye out for this. As I said earlier, this is going to be a very, very light touch on everything that took place in the project and everything we did. We'll try and squeeze in as much as we can into a very short time, but do look out for that evaluation report. We will also have a children's engagement report coming out also in about a month. And a system change blueprint as well. So all of those will sort of capture a lot more robustly what actually happened throughout the whole project. But if you go to the next slide, Kira. So this was the IAP change story. You'd think I'd be able to say that right after all this time. So what it really shows here is the kind of the ways. So this was written, just to make it clear, this was written quite at the beginning of the process, sort of not at the very, very beginning, throughout that first year. And it sort of described the way IAP intended to use co-production methodologies. It intended to use learning how to be system leaders and research and evaluation throughout to change practice that would lead to these long-term changes within the local authority. We used an improvement methodology So that was sort of using that plan, do, study, act idea, which is very sort of cyclical. It's quite short term. So it's like focusing on a small change, doing it, see what emerges, and then using sort of small measurable cycles in that style, and then reflecting on whether to adapt, adopt or abandon completely. So that happens where something works really well, and then you can make the argument why it would be you might as well adopt that because it actually does work very well, and you've been able to measurably show that. Or you might want to make some changes and run it again, or you might decide that a different route is where you're going. So 3 activities as described: co-production, the system change side of things, and research and evaluation, and communicating that would lead towards engaging and empowering partners, that would increase knowledge, skills and access, and the longer term outcomes. Now, the longer term outcomes, now we're working with young people and their impact on their learning and development and growth, and we won't necessarily know about these longer term outcomes until further down the line, but that is the direction that we want to move in. If you want to go to the next slide, Kira. So again, this was the project plan. So it was 5 years, it was broken down. I love at the beginning of this that you have this lovely clean model that shows how it's supposed to look. So this is kind of how it was predicted to look, but not quite how it ended up looking. But it's interesting to acknowledge it because it kind of gives us a little bit of a map to kind of reflect on how things changed. So these were the anticipated priorities across each of the 5 years. So there was built in this idea of them exploring, of taking time, having a breath, looking at what was going on across South Lanarkshire, thinking about what the ethos would be, thinking about who would want to work with, who could be involved, who are those critical friends, thinking about doing the steering group, all of those kind of things. So that was built in, with the year 2 considering that we would start to reach out to young people, start having that engagement. Obviously, in retrospect, we can see there was a huge amount of overlap across each of these kind of themed descriptions. The first thing to prioritise, and I think Fiona did mention this, was COVID. Can't really, I know everybody's tired of talking about it, but can't underestimate the impact that it had on a project such as this. So it was just at the point at which we got our engagement coordinator, Kira, in post. I think it was literally like the day after or something she started her role, we went into lockdown. So the effect on the project then was huge in terms of reaching children and young people and trying to engage them with exploring what we thought they might want to do in terms of work. And she'll be describing later how we did involve children and young people with that when the in-person work was really suspended for quite a period of time. And the types of tests of change were impacted as well. So there was probably, reflecting back, there probably was a little bit of anxiety in that kind of year 1. I wasn't around, I kind of came sort of halfway through, but reflecting back, I think there was a little bit of anxiety within the project. It was quite a tricky project to describe because it wasn't going to necessarily just be an intervention, and that's the way people sort of automatically assume things are going to look when you've got a funding, you've got a bunch of money and you're going to try and reduce criminalisation. People anticipate that, they have an expectation of what that might look like. But this was going to be very different. It was going to be very fluid. It was going to be very led by children and young people as much as possible. And so there was maybe a bit of an anxiety about how to describe that, and there were some tests of change, and I'll explain a little bit what those are later. But little projects that we took on board that probably are quite different to how we ended up at sort of more near the end of the project. Once the COVID restrictions had lifted, the engagement work really blossomed and it really took off, and it was definitely not limited to year 2 at all. It's continued throughout all of the years right up till now, essentially, the very end of the year 5. Final year was anticipated to be more focused on the kind of the embedding the learning. And the final year we did focus a lot of time on those kind of learning events, presentations, written outputs, But right now sort of feels like that key time for this learning to really be embedded, to really be taken on board, to be scaled if appropriate. So I'm going to hand over, I'll be coming back later to talk more about the evaluation, but I'm going to hand over to Kira just now. So she's going to describe a little bit about the work she did with our young people.
Hello, I'm hoping that everybody can hear me because I can't see a thing for the presentation. So as Christina's obviously described our process, and I was just to walk you through specifically how engagement looked. So engagement was like very adaptable, but we're able to kind of refine this down to our kind of key principles of how this worked. Young people were involved either one-to-one or in groups, and that was an important part. So you'll see we start off here saying about providing choice for the young people. It was important that the young people could engage in a way that was suitable for them. As I say, that might have been that it was one-to-one or part of a group, but it also meant that the young people had the choice in terms of how involved they wanted to be. If they wanted to see the project right out from start to finish, they want to be involved in evaluation, the design, idea generation, or if there's maybe just a topic that they're particularly interested in and they wanted to just share their views that one time, then that was also available. It was important to us to find areas that suited them as well, so down to like where and when activities and sessions would take place. It was about making sure that the young people were able to take part in activities when and where it suited them, rather than having us or making them fit into our schedules. So that led to us using a whole host of different sort of platforms. Obviously, briefly mentioned that it was obviously started during COVID, so there was a lot of online. Sometimes there was young people who wanted to take part via phone calls, video calls. That went beyond COVID as well, though. We done them in community centres. We reached out, access young people through different means, whether that was on social media or through support workers. We always make sure to reach out to those that were typically seldom heard and marginalised young people to hear their to hear their experiences. And we, as I say, we can achieve that through opening up the different ways that young people could be involved. So there's a lot of thanks to our colleagues in social work and third sector partners for helping us reach different young people. Police Scotland as well for supporting us to do some, myself to do some like detached youth work, where we were able to meet young people who weren't engaging in any particular support services necessarily. It was important that we were creating a safe space and the structure that allowed for the whole project to be led by the young people in their decision making. So that formed the point, again, that it was in areas. First of all, it was in a room or a building or a place where they felt comfortable that we were going to them rather than them coming to us. It was also important that we tried to make sure that the young people were able to make informed decisions and share their views without, or at very least minimal, external influences from like other services, for example. It's important that we validated the young people's experiences and celebrated their contributions. We've done this through acknowledging and rewarding the valuable expertise that they were bringing, ensuring that the young people realised that they were the experts in this realm. As there was an example one time, the young people said we were leading a session, the young people turned and went, "Oh, I don't know, yous are the experts." And we're like, "Whoa, wait a minute, yous are the experts, we can't do any of this without yous." And that, in terms of sort of recognition and reward, if you like, it was really varied and depended on the individual young people. For some, and that's what we adapted with the young people to decide exactly what worked with them for them. So for some, that was things like they just wanted to have a takeaway when we met and make sure that we had time to just have fun and play games during our sessions. Others, it was like they would like to work towards going on a trip and days out. some young people, depending again on ages and stages. It was gift vouchers, and others work towards achieving SCQF level 3 and 4 qualifications. And the most important part here was about recognising the trauma caused by the system when rights have not been respected in the past, and realising that it's taken a slower process, baby steps, for example, into building up the young people's confidence that their voice does matter and that they can shape change, which leads us nicely on to the sharing of power. The most important part of this was about having that continuous feedback loop. What moves us away from consultation and into co-design is the fact that the young people were involved throughout the process, and that's where the feedback loop becomes really important. Of course, where possible, we want to involve the young people in as many meetings, decision-making opportunities as possible, but sometimes it's not possible because when we need the people in power to be there, or it's maybe not feasible, it's maybe not something that the young person wants to be in, and they're happy for us to take their point forward. But the important part there was about making sure that the young people were kept informed and that a decision wasn't made without going back to them. So, for example, I'm sure we've all been in situations where we've shared it in with the best means and in the world and intentions. You can go into a meeting, you share that idea, and everybody's excited and wants to support that idea, but it can quickly move away from what the core principle was for the young people, the core aspect was for the young people. So we made sure that, okay, we would approach decision makers, we would approach those that can support a test of change, the young people's ideas, but we would find out how could that actually be implemented realistically and bring it back to the young people to say, this is where we're at, this is what people are saying, how do we want to take the next step, where do we go next? Now that maybe slows down the process, but it makes sure that it was truly led by the young people, and the excitement that the young people got by hearing the people that were involved and listening to their work really encouraged them, built up their self-esteem around about this area. And the young people were great at telling us, you know, when we maybe had like a wee stumbling block, they were great at problem solving round about that in ways that we probably would never have thought of. And we were able to kind of change that power balance where we had, for some of our tests of change, we actually had young people, we had the services pitching directly to the young people. So they put out their idea, what they would like to happen, and asked service providers if they would be able to facilitate that within the realms of their parameters of what they wanted that to look like. And the services then came and presented to the young people, which again obviously put them right in the heart. So remember to breathe. Overall, engagement did follow a pretty similar pattern, following those principles that I've described, and this led to 10 different tests of change. 1 year early, and I would love to go through each of them, but of course we have limited time, so I'm going to run you through a couple here. 1 year early test of change was the Junior Pathfinders project, and this was transitional support for young people transitioning between primary and secondary school. The Pathfinders project was already running in secondary schools. It was a pilot, and the feedback was already telling us that from professionals and young people that it was really working, it was supportive. And of course, as Fiona mentioned earlier, we already knew that engagement in full-time education is how critical that is, and that's where we kind of at that point we were taking that sort of traditional approach to design, and that we identified a problem area and a solution, and then worked in a participatory way with young people to influence how that went forward. So we said, here's our idea, how can we develop it with the young people, who fed into what we would what that service would look like, what should be brought forward from the original pilot, what needed to be changed for that age range, what the staff would look like, what in terms of skills and qualities, and developed it that way. As the project progressed, we then our levels of sort of co-design adapted as well. So to kind of take you through a journey of that, we had a group at the beginning of 2021, and it was a group of young people with experience in the justice system. And we worked alongside an organisation called Street Cones to support the young people to develop to co-design a short film, and it was fictitious based on their lived experiences. And from that, we then worked with the young people to identify that, allowed us to identify with the young people what was important to them from their experiences. And the key message from that video was around about feeling like sometimes services treat them like a case, and they wanted people to support staff to see them as an individual, their interests and hobbies, where they would like to go, their potential, and not just their past and what's written in a record about them. They also were really keen to support other young people. So from this information and alongside the young people, we were then able to co-design 3 further tests of change. And that included, initially we had the relationship-based practice, where justice experience and care experience young people helped us co-design that training programme for social work and practitioner staff, and around about how best to form relationships with young people. It then led to us developing, co-designing a Roll With It programme, which was where the young people designed a diversionary workshop for young people in early secondary school, and it involved also the co-design of their own board game, which led to the name Roll With It, because that was the name of the game, and that became the name of the workshop as well. And it also led on to us developing change in the system. So the young people's original video was called Trapped in the System, and they felt like the work that they were doing with IAP was like, well, do you know what, that's how we felt, was trapped in the system, but this work that we're doing with IAP is about changing that. So they went with the name Changing the System, which led us on to a further test, which was around about how can we meaningfully involve young people long term in South Lanarkshire in service and system change, and design more so, through creative means. So we run graffiti workshops where the young people were able to share their views around about that creative way, and the feedback for that was around about, and the basis of that was young people were telling us that that was the important thing for them. It was much easier to discuss their views when it was their views on a piece of paper or a visual or something creative, I guess, when they were speaking about something that was tangible in front of them, rather than just their thoughts and feelings. So I'm going to briefly stop sharing for 2 seconds to share a wee video with you, which just gives a wee idea of some of the impact that IAP had on our young people that were involved. I'm going to make sure that my audio is working. There, it's there. Share audio. And I will say that it is quite quiet, so you might need to turn up the volume on your device. But here we have 2 young people sharing their views.
I used to be quite a shy person. I think we both did. We both used to be really shy people. But with like IAP, like the fact that I've been given a voice and like a platform to do it on, it's made me become so much more confident in myself and my voice. Like the fact that my thoughts and opinions have been heard, and it's like create this big massive thing. It's amazing. Like IAP is so important to me at this point.
I feel like especially as young people, you don't really see young people out there on the news talking about such sensitive topics. A lot of people don't want to bring up, especially because like I'd say childhood trauma, a lot of people have experienced this when they were younger, and they just don't know how to communicate. And I feel like as a younger person, given that platform, when they see other young people talking about it, it raises questions and it allows them to explore different things that they've experienced and how they can make changes or how they can speak up or who they could contact. I think it's really, really good. I keep saying that I'm so happy that it's gone into schools, but I'm genuinely so happy that it's gone to young people. It's like made by young people for the young people.
Yeah, I feel like, see, like, I think one of the big things was about like, the fact that it's going into schools and stuff is because there's like quite like a few people that is like, oh, they're too young to understand. We're not too young to understand. We know more than you think.
Kira, you're still on mute.
Thank you. I was just saying I've just got one more video. It's the same.
And meeting new people. I'm confident with myself, like talking to people and meeting new people and like pushing my comfort zone.
I think I'm less nervous than I was before. That people used to come to me for advice because I'm like, it's not really got to be believable, but I'm not a friendly person. So people would always come to me for advice, and I wouldn't really know what to say. But seeing now that I've done IAP, I'm like, I do know what to say, and I do know who to tell them who to go to and how to get help. And I think I've helped myself as well with my confidence and who to speak to, and my pals and stuff, and how to deal with things.
So I am just going to bring us back to our slides. Oh. So I'm just, that's the most from myself in terms of engagement. I guess overall it was about being adaptable, ensuring that our young people were in the driver's seats throughout and continuing to advocate the young people's voices. Alongside that was a big thanks has to go to all the partner agencies that were involved for bearing with me as I shakily tried to explain what IAP was in the very beginning when it was so loose, and we had to go with, we don't know what it's going to look like, because if we knew what it was going to look like then it wouldn't be co-design. So I'm going to hand you back to Christina, who will continue us through how this process, what the engagement and that then led to in terms of longer term change with us within IAP.
Oops. Thank you, Kira. So yeah, thank you for that. Those were two groups of young people. We had a celebration event in the summer where they received certificates and lots of recognition for the work that they had done. And it was a wonderful day. In terms of back to the evaluation, so in terms of measuring impact, I decided to use a socioecological systems theory to kind of structure my thinking around this. So ecological systems theory describes the interactions between individuals and their environments, and how these kind of complex relationships affect development over time. So according to this model, and this is the one I went with, it's a Bronfenbrenner model, there are many interconnected systems that make up a person's environment. They all interact to influence and shape the individual. It talks about the interdependence of each of these levels and the interaction between them. Bronfenbrenner suggested that the more nurturing and encouraging environments lead to better developmental outcomes, which I suppose makes absolute sense when you think about it. So as IAP was not a new service, new intervention, something that could be easily wrapped up in a bow, but something more broad, something that was encompassing individual work, group work, system change across a whole local authority, it made sense to kind of use this type of model to explore the impact of IAP. So for this socioecological way of looking at it, these are, you can use 4 or 5 nested systems. I've used 4 just because it fit our structure slightly better. You can see at the centre or the bottom of this model, this is the individual child in their little microsystem, based within their day-to-day interactions with parents, family, friends, their community, etc. And around about that are all these outer sections with it, but all nested within one another. Excuse me. So these reflect the sort of interpersonal interactions between. So the next level is the interpersonal. So that reflects that kind of interactions between caregivers, neighbourhood teachers, schools, all of these things that seem to be getting slightly further away from the child, maybe in physical sense, but they're not. They all have impacts. These layers reflect the different systems around that child, moving further from them, but remaining really impactful on them. And these nested systems, the further you go out, they go on to encompass social services, local policy, laws, legal systems, national policy, practice, all of these kind of things that seem more esoteric to the child, but actually have a huge impact on their life. So what I did was I kind of mapped out the ways that IAP has had impact on these various levels around the child. So each system within this model, it interacts with each other sort of bidirectionally in different complex ways. So, for example, decisions that are made on that kind of national level, national macro level, will impact on the way that local authorities and organisations make choices and decisions. Within that next system, social work, social services, school and community are all impacted. And these strategies that they decide will impact on the families and impact on the child. As I said, it's bidirectional, so that the child will also have impact on their family and their requirements, their needs, other services, and impacting the wider system. So it goes up and down. So IAP has worked across all of those systems to various extents. So if you go on to the next slide, I'm going to kind of use a bit of an example. So we've got these 10 tests that changed, all very, very different, all very, very unique. And I know Kira's touched on a couple of very different ones, one that was based on looking at schools and supporting transitions for children moving from primary to secondary school, which is obviously a very key time. And also the other one she touched on was, and I've blanked on which one it was. Which one did you cover?
Changing the system.
Changing the system. Yes, a very complicated one that had multiple layers. I'm going to talk a little bit about the gender-based violence group. So you can sort of see how the engagement and the work with children and young people and their interest and focus on the impact and prevalence of gender-based violence. That was something they were very, very keen to explore. And actually the two girls that you saw at the during that piece of film were reflecting, they were involved in the gender-based violence group. So they did some pure research work. They designed, they worked with me, they were immense. They created an online survey to really capture what was going on in terms of gender-based violence, what was the experience of that amongst their peer group. It went from age 12 to sort of 17. They then went on from the learning from that. They worked with a graphic designer and they created an animated film based on that learning. They then worked with Women's Aid to create an in-school workshop, which would also support children and young people within the schools to explore this as an issue to them. Their link with Women's Aid came about because of the shared links and priorities within the Children's Planning Committee in South Lanarkshire. So this test of change had made it to the Children's Services Planning, and Women's Aid were also prioritising working in schools, and so it was a perfect synergy. So that's where these partnerships come together. So that sort of individual test of change therefore has impact on that kind of micro level, on the children themselves, on that kind of mesosystem level, and on the exosystem level. So using that kind of socio-ecological structure, we can see how one test of change kind of straddles all of these different nested systems. We go on to the next one. I mean, we could talk on all of the different tests of change. They are, almost all of them are summarised into reports, and you can access them on our website, and we can share that link with you at the end. So in terms of system change learning, I just want to reflect a little bit more broadly. We can't describe all of the learning within a single webinar. I wanted to touch on some of it. So there had been that kind of cultural shift about the power of inclusion and participation, and I think we've all felt that has really become so much more key in the last few years. Obviously supported by the Promise and the UNCRC in terms of children's rights and making children's voices really powerful and key. thank you, Sally, in ensuring that they have their say is absolutely valued. But when organisations or practitioners change that way of working, it is uncomfortable. It is unpredictable. It requires that sharing of power that Kira described earlier, and that's hard. So we use that methodology, that improvement methodology idea. So designing these small tests of change, testing quickly, that can be really powerful to quickly identify what is working. But it does require the sustaining of those ripple effects. Otherwise, it runs the risk of remaining, remember that thing that was done a couple of years ago, what happened to that? So it does need, so beyond this sort of testing phase, it does need that organisational buy-in. We also identified the importance of relationships at every level. So that is between everyone involved, different partnerships, different third sector organisations, local authority, all of this. And of course, prioritising communication, because that's vital to ensuring that people know what's going on and feel heard. And of course, engaging with the children and young people and acting with their permission and using that kind of ongoing feedback loop that Kira described, acting sort of as their conduit sometimes to ensure their voices are actually heard in the places they need to be heard, with those that hold that kind of decision-making power. And of course, and acknowledging that participation engagement doesn't all look alike. Even within our project, it looked incredibly different across every single test of change, completely different. But when we mapped our test of change on a standard model, I used Hart's model of participation, which is like a ladder. You might have all seen it. That there was real variation, and that, of course, was very much driven by the young people themselves and what they felt comfortable doing, what they were driven by, what they were passionate about. And if there is only time for consultation, and that sometimes is appropriate, there are ways to do that that make it not exploitative. So with communication, with choices, with flexibility and honesty, all the things that Kira covered in our sort of principles of engagement, those things can make a simple consultation much more powerful, much more based in reality, and really ensuring that children's rights are completely front and centre throughout that process. I'm aware of the time. I'm going to hand back to Fiona. It's going to just sum up a little bit about where IAP is now.
Okay, thanks very much, Christina. So what is inclusion? This slide is highlighting some of the key definitions that we use to inform the project and set direction in our planning. For inclusion as prevention, it was about ensuring that children and young people were included through engagement and development of key relationships in order to build trust, enable those young people to begin to impact on the design and delivery of systems and supports around them. And for us all, it was about thinking differently. Next slide. So here we have the 5 principles of inclusion as prevention outlines kind of thing, and it's important to make the time to consider how decisions are made, how are systems designed. Do professionals think we have to address need and vulnerability and have the anticipated outcomes? For example, we've talked a couple of times about school exclusions, and that is an important area to address. But do we as professionals make assumptions about how we respond to that? Well, children and young people see it through a different lens. And we have seen that in our tests of change, that actually the way that children and young people go about designing solutions and services and supports to ensure that they remain engaged in school is really very different to the adults and professionals around them. But through building and prioritising relationships, engagement and trust, inclusion as prevention was able to co-produce those solutions and test those out and evaluate them as well. So that's been really important. It's about sharing the power as well across organisations, communities, systems, young people. I mean, it's not easy to give up the power as professionals, but I think we really need to do that in order to achieve real change in line with the promise. And our evaluation shows that this way of working with children and young people is effective and has positively impacted those individuals, but also other young people who've benefited from the supports that they've designed. It's positively impacted professionals and the leadership culture. not only within South Lanarkshire, but all of our organisations as well. And it shows there is an appetite for cultural change in the way we work with children and families, and an appetite to do things at a much earlier stage. For example, inclusion as prevention definitely influenced the development of other more family community-based supports within the council. One of the challenges, however, is the longer-term impact of changes associated with earlier intervention can't be measured at this point in time, and that in later years attribution can be a challenge due to the range of other factors. But this makes this final slide all the more pertinent that we're going to finish on. It's about, to finish with this quote from Claire Lightoller, who I think is on the call, so nice to get quoted, but it remains relevant, and it describes a level of shift that is required to achieve inclusion as prevention across Scotland. It's not only about the system change, it's more importantly about the mindset that we need to collectively commit to and challenge ourselves to deliver on. Thanks very much. So it's time for some questions now, and I think we do have a couple of questions in the chat there. So one of the questions is from Kathy Sharp, and it's like, there's so much worth exploring here in more depth. How can we continue this conversation and ensure that the wider learning for system change is not lost? And Christina, are you able to give a first view on that?
Sorry, I was muted, and I was also massively distracted because I was scrolling down questions and I missed what you were directing at me. I'm so sorry. Is it about how we learn more about
It's about how we continue the conversation, make sure the wider learning for system change is not lost.
Yeah, I mean, obviously we do have like actual written outputs and things like that. Those are obviously one form of sharing learning. But it's about getting people in a room, isn't it? It's about getting people in a room and having these conversations. We did have an event, excuse me, I've still got that cold. When we did have a learning event in South Lanarkshire where we did invite a lot of sort of high hygiene types, it's a technical term, in a room together where we did explore a lot of the emerging findings in terms of the evaluation, and really explored what they are already doing in terms of putting young people's voices into the centre, what the appetite was for that. What we found was that there is a huge appetite. There are barriers that get in the way of that. I think a lot of it is about supporting the workforce as well, because there's a huge enthusiasm to work. I mean, these are people who work on the front line. They work with children, families all the time. They know a lot of these children. They have these relationships, but it's getting that transmitted up to the sort of decision makers above that. And we spend a lot of time thinking about creating the safe space to work with the children and young people to ensure that they've got their voices heard. Not sure there's as much in terms of creating the safe space for practitioners to also because they are acting as advocates a lot of the time. And I think that is a bit that just needs a little bit more work, but a lot of it is just getting people in a room together, and then people making commitments, championing, embracing the idea of it, acknowledging the importance of it, seeing that where it works, that there are limitations. There does seem to be a lot of research done with young people in terms of participating, and they come up with these great ideas, and they are really effective, but getting that translated into system change is trickier. I might ask Tim to come in here and lob this one at him, because I suppose that's kind of the next level of translating it, isn't it?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and Kathy, I think your questions and comments in the chat are really well made, and I guess this whole way of working, I think, is quite kind of fundamentally different to kind of business as usual within local partnerships and kind of systems change, and kind of what you were describing. I can't remember if it was Fiona or Kira kind of at the beginning, but this whole like notion of having an aim and a destination in mind, but no clear path of how to get there, is deeply uncomfortable and deeply counter to a lot of ways that typical systems of support for young people are designed, structured, commissioned, and delivered. But really, if we're going to if we're going to design different future for young people and have young people designing their own futures, it requires that fundamentally different mindset and way of structuring things. So, you know, I think, you know, demonstration of what's been achieved, and you know, Dartington's been involved in a few of the kind of early action system change initiatives within the kind of Scottish context. But actually, I think the IAP work is just so fundamental and powerful and kind of radical in its approach. This small tests of change, incremental changes in the system, really trying to like shift patterns and ways of thinking is critical. But I think really to continue that, you know, so we've modelled what can be done. Yeah, it does require significant resource to do it, and a lot of that resource has been sucked out of the system over the last few years. So, you know, this type of ambition, putting young people in the lead, requires investment and resourcing, and it requires time, and it requires sitting with the discomfort. We've modelled what can be achieved through doing that, and I think, you know, critical is just to try and instill that those patterns and ways of working within South Lanarkshire, but also connect to other places who might be open to trying something different. So I think this conversation needs to continue. Otherwise, this would have been a gloriously wonderful experiment, but I think it could be a lot more than that.
Thanks, Tim. There's another question in there just from Kathy, keeping us on our toes, and it's what system changes occurred do you feel most confident about being likely to endure for now? And I think, I mean, I can answer that briefly, and then if Kira wants to come in and say anything, but I think we've tried really hard to ensure the sustainability of the supports and engagement with young people in South Lanarkshire, you know, for example, through a Justice Champions Board, so those young people are on the same footing as some of the Care Experience Champions Board, but also through sustainability of funding for some of the groups we had, for example, the test of change around grief and loss and the young people who were engaged in that, and so that work continues, and that, you know, we've got that ongoing input to co-designing materials and supports for children and young people in schools. And of course there are embedded you know, there's things that are embedded within the schools in South Lanarkshire that the girls in the video were referring to earlier. So it's about continuing that, but we can't stand still. It's like co-production is an ongoing process. So what the young people, you know, during our 5 years have been saying, the next 5 years might bring something different. And Tim does refer to the resource, and it's really important. Kira's role has been fundamental in terms of that engagement and working and dedicated time with the young people and taking that forward, and I think that's really, you know, fundamental. And I know in the comments that Fiona Dyer said it would be great to share the learning throughout Scotland. I mean, it would be great to take this approach across Scotland and in the different local authorities, and I think we'd start to see some different ideas emerging. I don't know if any of my co-hosts have got anything to add to that.
I'll maybe say something. Just, I guess, agreeing completely with what Fiona you've just said there, but if we were to, no, I was every time I tried to say, oh well, I pick one and talk about it, but I find about like another three that comes alongside it. But I guess maybe to touch on what you were saying there, Fiona, about like co-production is continuous, and that just because we've maybe found a solution at this point, it doesn't mean that doesn't change, and it's about continuing to run that process. And I guess like the Ask group that we mentioned there, it's a good example of that. So the Ask group was co-designed as support, and initially the test was initially designed to support young people who felt they had an absent carer in their lives, and it was about young people having a safe space with people with similar experiences to them, and having the opportunity to learn different skills that they would maybe have had from a parent or carer that they were missing, sort of thing. And but a big key part of that was that it was youth led. So Covey had to run that test. They were successful in their pitch to the young people. So the young people chose Covey. Covey ran that and did an excellent job in supporting the young people who were initially designed it to become young leaders. And that test, though that came to the end, it's now been taken on with additional funding within South Lanarkshire Council from additional funding for CORA around about supporting young people in a similar way with care experience and justice experience. And again, it's about instilling that it's young person led, that there's that continuous cycle of co-production, that it will always be the young people involved in that service who are designing what that service looks like. And I think that's maybe one of the kind of good examples of sharing how that's a kind of long-term embedded change in model.
Thanks very much, Ciara. That's us running to the edge of our time, and I think we could have probably chatted on a bit longer. All of us are quite happy to take any emails from anyone who's interested in finding out more, and there's more information available on the website, and we will be sharing our evaluation report, our young person's participation report, and we look forward to chatting to any colleagues about that. And I'll just finish by saying, I see Claire's made a little comment in the chat there. Yes, I think there are other local authorities that are interested, and we're certainly, happy to have discussions with others, because we do think that this is a really great, very powerful way of working. So I'd just like to say thank you very much, and thanks for joining us today.